Friends, in August of this year, Jan DeVries received word that the Highland Park Presbyterian Church was going to be going into the process of discernment that's envisioned, we thought, under our just and gracious dismissal policy that you adopted as a presbytery a couple of years, really a year and a half ago, just over a year ago. Shortly after receiving that word, you've heard earlier today from Jan and from Marshall Zeman that Jan went to Egypt, and while she was in Egypt, there was a lawsuit filed against Grace Presbytery by the trustees of the Highland Park Presbyterian Church. As kind of an aside, the idea that the trustees should file a lawsuit before having gone to the session, as we understand, is against the Book of Order. The trustees of a congregation act only on the direction of the session and the congregation. The lawsuit included, at the time, a temporary restraining order, which kept us from taking certain kinds of actions until there was a court date. And at that court date, then there was what's called a temporary injunction set against us. That temporary injunction forbids us from taking any action against the church or its ministers, using the Constitution of the Presbyterian Church USA, the Book of Order, or any civil efforts, changing the locks or anything that directly or indirectly affects property that is put at issue by Highland Park's lawsuit. This means taking original jurisdiction, for example, is out of bounds. More recently, we have entered into an agreement with Highland Park that does not forbid us from doing specifically ecclesiastical things with regard to Highland Park, as long as they do not affect the property. But the temporary restraining order first, and then the temporary injunction have really barred us from having any voice at all on your behalf with respect to Highland Park. We, as you heard earlier, we have a litigation task group, and part of that task group was invited to enter into some discussions with a small group of persons from Highland Park, and to speak to that, Carl Travis, who is on that group, is going to speak directly to that. While he's coming up, it needs to be said that the specific content of those discussions is by mutual consent and mutual agreement, confidential, but we can speak in somewhat general terms about it. Carl?
Before giving you some sense of what those conversations looked like, let me tell you too, that since all of this began, we have retained the attorneys Vincent and Elkins, and we've been working through a legal process. And where does that leave us legally? Well, the suit is in state court. We have asked for a jury trial. We anticipate that as the case continues, we will not be in trial until late 2014. Prior to that time, we do hope to be in mediation with Highland Park Church and to see if this can be resolved in a way other than in the courtroom. And we have tried initial negotiation with a team from Grace and the litigation task force, which Stuart mentioned a moment ago. Those two conversations that we shared did not produce a result that either they or we wanted. That team was empowered by the council and the litigation task group, and includes Stuart Baskin and myself, Mike Vaughn for one of the two conversations, Mike Thompson and Jan DeVries. Highland Park's session appointed 4 ruling elders to represent the congregation. The conversations were held, by agreement, in Dallas, convenient to Highland Park. As neither of those teams had authority to conclude any agreement to explore an agreement. The conversations were essentially explanatory. The conversations were conducted in good faith and in the hope at the time that court action could become unnecessary. As we know now, that did not bear fruit. I will report that the conversations were by and large civil and respectful. The expectations of both Highland Park and Grace Presbytery were not met at the conclusion of those two conversations. And so those two groups quit meeting after October the 14th, because after that, just prior to the congregational meeting that had long ago been called, the Highland Park team was no longer empowered to meet with us. And so they have subsequently been renewed, but we have not worked to establish any other dates for further conversation. Sure.
As I mentioned before, we have had, on your behalf, no opportunity to present the Presbyterian Church USA in any sort of a positive light, partly because out of fear of, in some way, interfering with the temporary restraining order first and then the temporary injunction. We did not want to be seen as in any way running afoul of that for fear of running afoul of the civil courts. Instead, what our brothers and sisters at Highland Park received was a steady stream of reports from a PR firm that the session hired, and we kept track of what was coming out of that, and it was, from our perspective, a constant misrepresentation of who we are as Presbyterians. In fact, the only church-wide presentation on behalf of the Presbyterian Church USA was done by Ted Wardlaw, president of Austin Seminary, and his remarks, if you want to see them, are posted on the Grace Presbytery website. Ted went at the invitation of Highland Park, but even that was suggested by our team. The congregation voted on October 27th to leave the presbytery, leave the denomination, and join the Covenant Evangelical Order of Presbyterians, otherwise known as ECO. About a third of the members were present, but I do have to say they had established a quorum for that meeting of 5% of the congregation. This is problematic on two accounts. Number one, the Book of Order does not recognize a call for a congregational meeting by a session whose purpose is to withdraw from the denomination. That is something that is reserved, it's one of the powers of a presbytery. And whenever a congregation is in that kind of conversation, ordinarily the presbytery calls that congregational meeting and holds it. In the just and gracious dismissal policy, which this presbytery adopted last year, the dismissal calls for up to 50%, at least 50% of the congregation to be present and voting. Otherwise, what you potentially get is really, if you think about it, a minority of the congregation voting to leave, and then the congregation leaving. Further, the church has not sought dismissal from the Presbyterian Church USA, but has used the term disaffiliate, which is not recognized and not found in the Book of Order. Highland Park remains, from our perspective, a congregation on the rolls of Grace Presbytery until such time as you, the presbytery, dismiss it or dissolve it by vote, and its members remain on the rolls of Highland Park Presbyterian Church USA. Of the ministers on the staff, Joe Reitmeyer, Nelson Bell, Cyprian Gachenda, and Jay Lee have all publicly, and it's on video and in person, urged the congregation to withdraw and join ECO. Michael Walker, also on the staff as theologian in residence, has filed a declaration in the court proceedings supporting the lawsuit against Grace Presbyterian. The only one of the ministers, Presbyterian ministers on the pastoral staff who has not publicly encouraged people to vote for and go to ECO is Marshall Zeman, for whom we are most grateful and from whom you heard earlier today. Interestingly enough, though, Highland Park Presbyterian Church is now shown on the ECO website as having been received already, even though the stated clerk of our denomination corresponded with, and we received an email from Dana Allen, the executive director of ECO, assuring us that ECO would not receive a church, including Highland Park, until the presbytery has dismissed it. There has been no formal request for dismissal, and in fact, the idea of dismissal has generally been, no pun intended, dismissed on their part. So what are the presbytery's options at this point? We have been sued. We cannot simply decide one day, hey, we're going to get unsued. We have to defend the presbytery against this lawsuit. That's one of the things that simply must be done. But we have at least 3 options at this point. First is to continue with the litigation with every possibility and every expectation of winning the lawsuit. We could, and in some respects, would very much like to mediate the lawsuit to a satisfactory point, at which point both parties reach agreement and dismiss the lawsuit completely. Or we could simply withdraw, which would mean walking away from property and assets, and also leaving open the subversion of the property clause in the Book of Order. At this point, the council has elected to pursue the first 2 of those options, to follow litigation to see where it leads us, but also to pursue mediation to see if we can settle out of court. So what else are we doing? A couple of weeks ago, we had a meeting with the stated clerk of our denomination, along with the denomination's general counsel and one other officer from Louisville. We invited them down and had representatives of 2 other presbyteries in Texas, which are also facing these same issues. We have not received and are not likely to receive any financial support from Louisville. Those conversations are ongoing, though, as they monitor the litigation. Never say never, but to date there has been no financial support from the denomination. We have met with members of the congregation who wish to stay and who came to a forum at Preston Hollow Church on Sunday evening. Some people voted to stay PCUSA, but also want to stay with the congregation. They are a committed group, and several of those folks are here with us tonight. As you've heard, we have appointed a litigation task group which continues to meet regularly, and we have established a legal defense fund to which we would invite you to contribute as individuals. Most of the members of the litigation task group have contributed already, and others in the presbytery have as well. If you have never been involved in litigation, litigation is just expensive. And it is, to us, a tragedy that we're having to go through litigation. But once again, it was not what we chose to do. We are presenting tomorrow, and you've already received you've seen the proposal in the booklet, a recommendation for an administrative commission to mediate this situation on behalf of Presbytery. And we hope and we pray At this time, I'm going to ask Jan DeVries to come up, and you may have lots and lots of questions. You may have no questions whatsoever, but Jan is going to come up and be the member of the team who answers questions on our behalf.
Except for all the tough ones, which I'm referring to Stuart and Carl. I was thinking as I was sitting there that I could hear a pin drop in this room, and indeed this is a place where no presbytery expects to be or wants to be, and certainly that has been true of this presbytery and its council. What you have heard is a very general overview. We decided not to try to tell you too much at the beginning, not knowing exactly where your questions or concerns would be. And so there are 2 microphones here. If any of you wish to come forward, either to make statements or to ask questions within that 2-minute limit. I know Stacy will want you to identify yourself at the microphone as you ask your questions or make your statements. Otherwise, I'll be forced to talk for 20 more minutes.
Are there any people ready to approach the microphones? Please approach the microphone. Give us your name and where you're from.
Bob Butler, Crossroads Presbyterian. I was just wondering what the motivation of the Highland Park Church is in wanting to leave the PCUSA.
I can tell you, thank you, Bob, I can say that what is represented in the lawsuit is particularly the issue of wanting title to its own property, to not recognize that it's held in trust by the PCUSA. There have been other issues that have been raised in the lawsuit. There's also a reference to what I would describe as perceived doctrinal differences between PCUSA and the Evangelical Order of Covenant Presbyterians.
Questions? Comments? 2-minute speeches. Martha?
I'm Martha Wilson, and I'm a reserve elder from Highland Park. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you all. You all have had our backs. Those of us that are going to stay in the PCUSA, we thank you for your prayers and your commitment. There were a group of us that worked very hard with very short notice to get the word out about what was good about the PCUSA. And we made a difference. And now we're trying to figure out how we go forward as individuals and as a collective body. So thank you for your past prayers and your support. And we still need them. So thank you. I would say, if I have a moment, that we had 3 major issues. The property was secondary. And what everybody in our church was told was the PCUSA has no essential tenants. And the ECO does, very carefully listed. And that we would not be able to call the pastor we wanted. We're in a senior pastor search. And that we would not be able to get the senior pastor we wanted. And the other one was that the authority of Scripture is not held in biblical authority, and the Lordship of Jesus Christ is not held in high esteem by the PCUSA. And those were the arguments.
Thank you, Martha. Thank you. Questions? All the way forward. Sorry.
Madam Moderator, my name is Ryan Bear. I'm the pastor of Ridgely Presbyterian Church here in Fort Worth. A question about the status of the teaching elders that are present at Highland Park, and maybe also kind of a question for the clerk, what their status is in terms of membership in this body right now, and how the presbyteries continue to provide pastoral support for the teaching elders that are there. Thank you.
Let me take a stab at it, and if Jerry wants to correct me, he's entitled. The motions at the congregational vote on October 27th, I believe, were four. One was, do you want to leave the PCUSA and join ECO? Will you accept the current elders, deacons, and trustees as your ongoing elders, deacons, and trustees? A third one was, will you accept the present pastoral staff as ministers of HPPC ECO, and will you pay them the same thing that you're paying them now in terms of their compensation? And nuts, I'm trying to remember what the fourth one was. Just call me Rick Perry running for office. But there was an attempt to cover all, I know, the fourth one was the pastor nominating committee, of which Martha had been a member. Martha resigned from the pastor nominating committee. This is my personal opinion, Ryan. I don't think that it matters to the people who were currently serving in those positions that they are no longer listed as PCUSA elders, deacons, or trustees. The trustees who don't, in our polity, have to be elders, 4 were elders and 1 was a deacon. So they had all taken ordination vows. Grace Presbytery's Committee on Ministry on Tuesday will receive information about the ministers who are PCUSA who have not yet been received into ECO, and what the Committee on Ministry will decide to do at that point. God and the CLM know, but I don't know what will happen at that point. There certainly is none of the ministers have asked to be dismissed to ECO. Did I cover the constitutional things you wanted, or do you want enough?
Enough.
Okay.
Hi, Fritz Rich from St. Stephen, teaching elder, and I'm wondering about the retroactive effect of a decision like this. For instance, if we lost this decision, would churches that have already been dismissed be able to, or who have already withdrawn and perhaps couldn't get their property, would they be able to come back and say, nah, we want our property back after all?
No.
Okay, good.
No.
We've got someone else coming to the microphone.
Sure.
I'll be happy to repeat. This is Mona Bailey, honorably retired.
So my question is about ownership of the name of the congregation. And can I just put that subject out there and not repeat it?
Yeah, Mona is asking about the status of the ownership of the name Highland Park Presbyterian Church.
Mona, I can tell you that conversation about the name has come up. As far as we're concerned, Highland Park Presbyterian Church is a PCUSA congregation, and that includes the name.
I saw someone else rising, yes.
I was listening to you talking about the ecclesiastical allowances, and when I was at Louisville Seminary, Cliff Kirkpatrick was one of my professors, and he had us, he's the former clerk of General Assembly, and he had us read the eco-doctrinal things, and he also had us read the PCUSA doctrinal things. And up until the end, most of it is very similar. Actually, some of it was almost cut and paste from the PCUSA website to the ECO. And in light of hearing what was just said, I'm just wondering if can't we respond to that from a theological perspective as a presbytery gracefully? At least the theological differences that they're claiming.
You know, Rachel, that's a great idea. However, we have no access. We have no access to the session. We have no access to the congregation. And that's the result of having a temporary injunction.
Okay. And I mean, are there any, like, as far as media things, like, it seems to be that also seems to be circling around that Highland Park is getting a voice and Grace is just sort of, or just being silenced. I guess
I would not say Grace Presbytery is being silenced, but we're not the ones who hired a PR firm and, you know, have made multiple videos and put them on our website and, you know, had a press release weekly. I mean, what we have done is try to keep the presbytery fully informed of any issues pertaining to the litigation. And the FAQ that was posted was one way to answer some of the questions. We posted Ted Wardlaw's remarks. We posted John McCoy's. Both of those dealt heavily with theological issues.
The time, your timing is that 8 minutes, since Rachel's still staying. Sorry.
Well, Rachel, I think it's a good question about is there some way to get involved in conversation? And I can say to you that we were told by Highland Park's attorney that the reason they filed the lawsuit was to engage us in conversation. But it's really impossible to engage in conversation when, you know, an ecclesiastical response would be to say, we want to call a meeting of the session to meet with the session. Not only was that not possible, we were never invited to meet with the session. I was encouraged by a member of the session to call a person on the session who was responsible for lining up people to come. I had, as of August 30th, when Paul Williams and I went to meet with Joe Reitmeyer, I said to him, look, in anticipating Highland Park's moving into discernment, I've already talked to Hunter Farrell and to Craig Barnes, and both of them are prepared to come and be part of the discernment process. And we also, in that first conversation where Paul and I were, there were questions raised about the dismissal policy and was a 50% quorum essential, and they'd like to have a 30% quorum. We said, you know, that the phraseology in the dismissal policy says ordinarily, that we were prepared to talk about negotiating that. I said to them that Joe wanted this to be done as expeditiously as possible. I said that in anticipation of that there had been some informal conversations about people who might serve on the Presbyterian ministry team. He indicated that they would go ahead and call a congregational meeting. Paul and I said that that was not part of the polity, pointed out where in the Book of Order are the 6 reasons that a congregational meeting can be held, and one of them is not to engage in schism. So the point at which we tried to have conversation was on the front end. And interestingly, the reason that I had scheduled the meeting with Joe Reitmeyer on August 30th was because Highland Park had worked with me and with Committee on Ministry and staff in the transition from Ron Skates leaving to Joe Wright Myers becoming the interim. And the last time I had talked to Joe, he had been very supportive of the PCUSA, and he wasn't talking about leaving. But between June and when Paul and I met with him, he had changed his mind and felt that leaving the PCUSA was the most important thing to do for Highland Park. Yeah. No. Yeah. So, the purpose of that meeting was really to say, Joe, you shifted roles from being an associate to being interim. What can we do to support you? How can things move ahead between Grace Presbyterian and Highland Park? And instead, what we realized was that the dismissal, the effort to move into discernment was upon us. In fact, the session had scheduled a meeting on September 21st for the purpose of determining whether or not to enter discernment. And the earliest they could vote on that was the following Monday, the 23rd. And that was what the timeline was Paul and I left with. And, you know, instead in the middle of the night in Egypt, I get this call from Mike saying, do you want the good news or the bad news?
Any other questions, comments, concerns?
Clay Allard, no Cliff Dallas. This just breaks my heart. And I would plead with the Presbytery not to give in to the anger that will make this division worse than what it is, and that we find a way to be the church together. We do not agree, and there are things that are coming forward in this denomination we will not agree on. But there are many of us who do not agree who are here, and who will be here. We were planted here, and we will stay here. And if we can find a way to be the church together from this point forward, perhaps we don't have to be here.
I couldn't agree more, Clay. Thanks.
Lindsay Woods, teaching elder at Gethsemane Presbyterian in Fort Worth. And I'd like to just say that I am very grieved by this whole process. For those of you that know me publicly, there is very few that would expect I would have similar theological views of those from Highland Park. I'm very much on other spectra. However, I had very close public relationships with many of the leadership, both pastoral and elder, in Highland Park. I worked on commissions, committees. I personally was one of the individuals that helped work on the transfer of membership of some of their teaching elders into the PCUSA, and we discussed doctrinal issues. And it grieves me that the statements claim that I do not believe in the Lordship of Jesus Christ or in the authority of Scripture. That being said, I believe as a Christian they are still my allies and my friends. They are my brothers and sisters in Christ. And I see this as largely how we as a presbytery have failed to build effective public relationships. That we ever got to a point where the best way to communicate was lawsuits. And my prayer is that we find a way to do that. I also ask, does the presbytery have plans for pastoral care for us? And does the presbytery leadership have a plan for teaching us how to lament this through this process?
I'll be glad to make sure that Melinda Beach wrote that down for the council, which we'll be having a conversation on Wednesday, Lindsay. And like you, I share the loss of working relationships with people who voted to go to ECO, who I consider my brothers and sisters in Christ.
Other questions? I see no one rising to speak. This would be your last chance.
You may never be able to ask me a question again.
We have one more person. Here it comes.
I never have asked you a question.
Can you tell us your name?
James Salak from Ridgely in Fort Worth. Do you know what percentage of the members of Highland Park want to remain with the PCUSA?
You know, that's a very good question, and actually Martha might have a better answer, or Marshall, but one of the things that we have discovered is that there are people for whom that building is Highland Park Presbyterian Church. And for some of them, it's an emotional tie. For some of them, it's, you know, Martha grew up in Highland Park. And Martha's only 6 months older than I am, so you can see how long she's been there. And I think, as we learned from the Longview situation, there are many people who end up deciding that they want to stay, and they want to stay in the place they call church. I could tell you what I personally think the numbers would be, and let me say it this way. I think that there are enough people to sustain a PCUSA ministry in that property.
Other questions? You go ahead. Go ahead. You were first.
Nita Nunn from First Church in Allen. About 4 years ago, I moved from New Orleans, Presbytery of South Louisiana, and this is like, and the way I got to feel was like, this is a divorce situation. You know, the church and the presbytery, and the way they go at it is the way some people will go after divorce. The question is the children of the divorce, and the people who love the presbytery, who've been involved, who find that their calling to work through that presbytery as their mission, are the children of the marriage, and they should be, I don't know how to say it, it's just, everyone needs to consider that.
Olive Reben in the back agrees with you, but I don't understand.
That's it.
I think for all of you who don't know, South Louisiana Presbytery ended up being sued over a church property, and one of the attorneys working with Highland Park is the same attorney who worked with the case in South Louisiana.
Matt Calvers, teaching elder and validated ministry chaplain at Texas Hope Presbyterian Hospital. The money question, which we don't want to talk about, but I also know what it did to South Louisiana Presbytery. Basically, Presbytery stopped, I think. What is the impact so far, if you can even talk about that, and what do we look at for next year?
We don't know next year. I can tell you that the Presbytery has paid $200,000. And actually, that's in the financials. isn't it? Oh, it's in the October financials, so this is a preview.
Andy Wong, teaching elder at large and parish associate for evangelism at Gethsemane Presbyterian Church. The other side of the money question, and then maybe a comment. How much is the property valued at?
The property is conservatively valued, this is just the property, at $30 million. This does not include any of the investments, the foundation, trust agreements. Within the last year, Andy, the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission in the case of the Danville Community Church and San Francisco Presbyterian took action to require presbyteries in negotiating dismissals to take into account not just the value of the real property, but also the value of all of the assets of the congregation.
And my comment, I've been sort of running through my head for scriptural references that might bear on this situation. And the one to me that came to mind was the parable of the lost son, the prodigal son. And it strikes me that when the son asked for his inheritance and wanted to leave, the father gave it freely. And it strikes me that the father did that in an effort to offer grace to the son, knowing that the way to love the son was to welcome him back at a future time. So I thought that was an appropriate scriptural reference. Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
I want to say, in conclusion, first of all, I happened to be reading Henry Mallon last night after midnight on the prodigal son. And the other thing that, if you do not know this book, I know it's not Shirley Guthrie, but Presbyterian Beliefs by Donald McKim, which is a shorter read, has study questions, could be used by your session or any adult class, is in the Resource Center, though this one came off my bookshelf, and gives you a way to learn what the PCUSA does believe, which I think is part of what we have learned from this situation, that when you have a congregation in a session that does not know, it's much easier to imagine leaving for somewhere else. I want also to say to you personally that many of you have written me, have called me, and most of all, many of you have prayed for me and for Grace Presbytery through this. I cannot tell you how important that has been to your council, to me personally, to be uplifted in prayer and to be encouraged by God's Spirit through you, and to be welcomed by such a great cloud of witnesses. That is the Presbyterian family, and that is what Jesus Christ as our peace means and invites us into, and I hope you will continue to do so. And please don't hesitate to call or write your questions. Again, I'll refer all the hard ones to Carl and Stuart to respond to you, but I want to thank you for being the means of God's grace to each other and to your council. Thank you.
The people that you have seen before you tonight making these reports have prayed, have worked hard, have really tirelessly been trying on your behalf to work in a way that would honor the body of Christ. And they all deserve our deepest thanks. And I hope you can see just a glimpse of what the council's been working on, what this litigation task force has been working on, and you would be proud. You would be proud of what they've been doing. I am proud. A couple of notes. Please put your name tags in the baskets. You will re-register tomorrow morning. And please don't leave your booklets. Take them and bring them back. I'd like to close with a word of prayer. This has been a heavy night.